I've got these. I'd rather not hand them out until I've made use of them.
Quite good
but
point.
If I could possibly.
Welcome everyone to this lecture this evening from Alastair McIntosh. Welcome to you all, and thank you for coming out on this very cold evening. I'm sure you were wrapped up well coming down to Mayfield, Salisbury, but it's great to see you all here tonight. My name is Sandy Forsyth, and if you don't know me, I'm the minister here. Like many faith communities, and indeed like much of the wider population, our awareness of COP26 and the ways in which it addressed or didn't address the pressing issues of the climate crisis has left us with some burning questions after it's now all over. Where does it all leave us? What does it ask of the world? And what especially can ordinary people and faith groups such as churches do? Is there anything more that we can do? Is there anything more that we can be to accelerate the degree of change that we all know is needed? Mayfield Salisbury is a member of Eco-Congregational Scotland, and we're blessed to have a very active eco group within the church, raising awareness and encouraging measures that people can take individually and as a congregation and on a wider national and international level. And I'm delighted that having been inspired by Alastair's writing, not least his most recent book, Riders on the Storm, they invited Alastair to speak with us tonight, and indeed we're delighted that he has accepted and that he is here and that we're all here joining him. I'm sure that what Alastair will bring this evening will be invaluable in exploring what's now called for post-COP26, especially in the implications for a spiritual calling and a witness in the world. A few words before we start of introduction of Alastair, if I may. Alastair, as you may well know, is a writer and broadcaster. He is an activist on social and environmental and spiritual issues. He was raised in the Isle of Lewis. He is a past director of the Centre for Human Ecology and an honorary professor at Glasgow University. His books include Hell and High Water, Climate Change, Hope and the Human Condition, on the cultural and spiritual dimensions of climate change. Rekindling Community, on the spiritual basis of interrelationships. Soil and Soul, People versus Corporate Power, on land reform and environmental protection. And most recently, as I mentioned, Riders on the Storm, weaving together science and politics and psychology and spirituality to guide our response to climate change. Since 2004, Alastair and his wife have lived in Govan, where he's a founding director of the Galgale Trust for the Regeneration of People and of Place. A Quaker in his own faith, Alastair has lectured around the world at institutions including the World Council of Churches, WWF International, and the Russian Academy of Sciences. Alastair's focus in his writing is often to explore the deep roots of what it can mean to be fully human, and to use those insights to try to address the pressing problems of our times. After Alastair speaks with us tonight, there'll be the chance for a Q&A, so please do store up any questions that arise in your mind as Alastair speaks that you might have for him, and at the close we'll be able to ask Alastair some questions. But for now, it's my pleasure to pass over to him to address us. Thank you, Alastair, and would you please welcome him? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandy, and thank you, Alastair McGilchrist here, who has organised it. And can I just say, you mentioned my book, Riders on the Storm, The Climate Crisis and the Human Condition, and I had two principal scientific advisors, people who are real climate change scientists, who were giving me close advice. Actually, I had several, but there were two in particular, one of whom was Alastair's son, Graham, who's a climate scientist at Princeton University, and particularly kept me right on ocean currents and that kind of area, which his speciality is. David Armstrong Mackay was the other one, who is a climate modeler then at the Stockholm Resilience Institute. So that's how somebody like me is standing here in front of you. I have a general background, a first degree in earth sciences from Aberdeen University, from the geography department there, but that would not make me a climate scientist. To be a climate scientist, you have to be able to understand the way things are measured, the way things are modeled. It becomes highly mathematical. You have to have a very advanced understanding of these things, which takes many, many more years than I have studied. So I am simply a communicator on this. But in the wider sense of tonight's talk about human calling after COP26, that is when a more generalist and a more human perspective comes into play. And that's what I'd like to try and share with you tonight. Those of you who don't know me, I've gone profoundly deaf these days, and I carry these little microphones that I wave in front of people. They're directional, so that if there's any background noise, I can hear it. And there's one, when we come to Q&A, taped onto the roving mic, and that's why I'm holding my phone in my hand, because I control it on there. I just want to explain that, so you don't think I'm doing my emails while I'm talking to you, which my wife would be inclined to say, if you don't watch out, that's what he'll be doing. So here we go, folks. Human calling after COP26. And what I would like to do in this evening's sharing is address that particularly from the point of view of faith groups. We're obviously in a Christian context here, but this applies from any faith group, and by faith, I do not mean blind belief, but I mean a deep trusting, a deep confidence, confidere, con together, fidere, faith, a deep faith together that our lives and the world are not without meaning. You go out on a frosty night, and I must say I'm astonished to see so many of you in here tonight with the pandemic still going and ice frozen on the pavements outside. You go out on a night like this, and you stand and you look up at the universe and the astonishing reality of our senses, the empirical truth, the observable truth, is that there is something. And those who say we should always go for the simplest explanation, which requires no sense of any divine being or presence, typically base their arguments on what they call Occam's razor, which nicely mystifies it, or the principle of parsimony, which basically says that you should account for things on the simplest basis possible, unless otherwise necessitated. And I would say that when you go out and look at the universe and the reality that there is something, one way or another, you have to face that reality. You have to be open to the possible implications of that reality. And if you say, well, it just is and we don't have to explain it, then fair enough. If you say it just is, there is no need for any sense of divine grounding, then fair enough, but let us be realistic about what you're just saying. Because what you are basically just saying is, I believe in magic. And if we're going to go down the road of magic, then I would invite you to suggest it's only another step forward to consider the possibility of a divine milieu. And then we can look at our experience of life. If we are people of faith, in that sense of an openness, a trusting to deep reality, then what do we experience that draws us there? Have any of you ever had what you might think of as a spiritual experience? Perhaps listening to music, making love, hearing some inspiring words, watching a film, walking in nature, a sense of being wrapped, of being caught up in a sense of the universe, incorporating you and the meaning of your life into its symphony. And as many of you will know, back in 1901, Professor William James came over from America and delivered the Gifford Lectures in Natural Religion in the university that surrounds us in this milieu here, later published as The Varieties of Religious Experience. And what James charts out there, especially in his lecture on mystical experience, has been corroborated in the 120 years since then with extensive research into the reality that people do have experiences of spiritual reality, of the divine. And of what relevance is that to my theme tonight, of where the human condition is at after COP26? I would put it to you that if we frame our understanding of what reality is very narrowly in materialistic terms, that will lead you, along a particular limited set of course of actions. Whereas if we are willing to take a step of faith, perhaps encouraged by faith groups of whatever religion, I don't care what religion it is, so long as it's based on love. If you are willing to consider reality within the framing of the love that moves the sun and other stars around, then your sense, our sense, of human possibility and calling in these times will be infinitely wider. And that rather than seeing mainly despair out of the many failings of COP26, we may begin to hear a joyous music from that universe, an opening of our consciousness, an opening of our hearts and minds that might steer us to an expanded sense of what it means to be human beings on this earth in these times. We may even move to a position of saying, how fortunate are we to be living in these times? Because these times are times when we are being prompted to look more deeply at where we are at in the course of the evolution of life on Earth, and to look more deeply as to what that might mean in terms of how we live our lives. I've said that by way of preamble to tonight's sharing. And here we are. I know that you in this audience tonight, and to our friends listening online, you will be coming from many different perspectives, which may or may not be perspectives of faith. But here we stand in a place where, in the words of T.S. Eliot, prayer has been valid. And so I would like to now to start with a prayer. And because I mentioned the universe, and because I mentioned the Gifford Lectures, one that comes out of those, because in 1990-91, the University of Edinburgh invited Raymond Panikar to give the Gifford Lectures, subsequently published in a volume called The Rhythm of Being, where Panikarji defines peace. Peace be on you, peace be with us, as participation in the rhythm of the universe, the rhythm of reality. And 3 or 4 months ago, I was staying in Edinburgh with my friend Alastair Hulbert, who at the time when Panikarji was here was Secretary of Scottish Church's Action for World Development. And he and we, a group of us, arranged a conference in Glasgow in the Pearce Institute called No Life Without Roots, where we basically hijacked this great Hindu Christian scholar, this Indian Spanish figure who said, I am not half Hindu and half Christian and half Indian and half Spanish. I am wholly Indian, wholly Spanish, wholly Hindu, and wholly Christian. We hijacked him, took him through to the Govan to a packed Pearce Institute, where he gave his lecture on agriculture, technoculture, or human culture as part of the theme No Life Without Roots. And when Alastair handed me the manuscript, which is a very messy manuscript, it would need a lot of editing to see it published, I was nevertheless deeply struck by the opening paragraph, which I would like to read to you now. And I have some copies, as probably if people share, if they're from the same family group, you're welcome to take one. I brought them with me tonight. But I would like to share this by way of an opening prayer before further advancing my theme. Panikkāji wrote, and I suggest let this be Panikkāji's legacy to COP26. Let me begin with prayer. That is, becoming conscious of our sense of precariousness. Not only for ourselves, none of us has a solution to the world we tackle. None of us can offer a convincing program of action. None of us can offer a convincing program of action. The very word prayer suggests being conscious of our precariousness when we deal with such major issues. Not only the sense of our precariousness, also of the precariousness of the situation where we live, of this moment, which is our moment in time and history. Let me begin with prayer. That is becoming conscious of our sense of precariousness, of this moment, which is our moment in time and history. Amen. Sandy and Alastair were mentioning there the difficulty in a time of climate change in heating such a large church as this. Apparently, heat pumps won't do it. And as I stand here, I see you've all got your coats on. I have not got my coat on. But let us not just be spiritual about this, or rather, let our spirituality be an applied spirituality. Let us be practical. Because to deal with the issue, that now I'm settled down and I'm not moving, standing here, and I can feel, I'm possibly going to get a bit chilly without my coat on during the evening. If the camera up there can possibly zoom in on me, I don't know if it's attended, but I'm going to turn on, tune in, drop out, as the old mantra was. I'm going to turn on my electric jacket here. There we are. You can see it's got 3 different settings. I'll put it on medium setting just now and just zip it up. These cost sort of £40 to £100, depending on the fabric. And if I can just stand aside, for those of you who don't know, there's a battery in my pocket here. Now, that battery requires 2 pence worth of electricity to charge it up. And on the maximum setting, it'll last for about 4 or 5 hours. On the low setting, it'll go for 12 hours. And just gives a gentle, like wearing an electric blanket, a 5-volt DC electric blanket, like wearing that. Some of you might know these things. I mention it because, when we ask folks, how are we going to live with changes we need to make without too much discomfort? There are technologies coming our way. How do you deal with the cycle lanes? How do you use the cycle lanes in a hilly city like Edinburgh, as Fiona Stark was saying on our way here, well, that's where electric bikes become very useful. These are the kind of technologies that can start to change things. So what of COP26? Well, let us consider where we stand at this moment, at our moment in history. 30 years ago, I was teaching a couple of blocks along here in Buccleuch Place in Edinburgh University. I was teaching Human Ecology. And there was enormous excitement because it was the build-up to the Rio Earth Summit that took place in 1991, I think it was, or thereabouts. Notice I'm speaking without any notes, so don't always trust the facts I give you. It's from my head. If you want to trust the facts, then look in one of my books where I check things much more carefully, and I have people like your son to double and treble check it over for me. And there's huge excitement about the Earth Summit because this was going to be our last chance. And there was also a sense of gloom because we all knew the world was unlikely to do what was required of it. And although good things came out of the Rio Summit, particularly Local Agenda 21, which I'm sure some of you here probably cut your teeth on. There was quite a bit of funding went into local programs at that time. Basically, the Rio Summit came and went. And I can remember thinking at that time, you know, I bet you in 30 years' time we'll be having another Rio Summit or some such thing. And the world will be worse than it is now, and yet we will still be here, and we will still be saying this is our last chance. And I kind of lodged that into my memory, thinking, to use an old Presbyterian expression, still heard in the Isle of Lewis, thinking, if we're spared, then I'll log that in 30 years' time and see where we are. And here we are again, exactly the same, our last chance. And therefore, the air of more than disappointment, an air of quiet despair that I pick up in many people about the COP that has just passed. An air where some folks are trying to draw the best of it, saying, for example, well, we didn't manage to get them to phase out coal, but we got them to agree to phasing down coal. And beyond that, I don't know about you, but I don't remember much about what happened in COP26. In fact, I was saying to Fiona and John this evening that every time I'm asked to speak about COP26, do you know what I do? This is in spite of having written 2 books on climate change. I go onto Google and I write achievements of COP26 to see what they are. And then I forget them and I have to do it again. And what that says to me is that nothing much came out of it big enough to lodge into my memory. Now that may be proof to you of what an inadequate speaker you have here tonight. And if you wish to leave early, just remember the pavement is icy if we're spared. Oh, I'm sorry. Some of that old Hebridean theology, really got into me, and I love it, actually. The Quaker stuff is all very right on and what have you, but sometimes you can't beat the old Presbyterian kayaks, the old women, the old ladies. I mean, I remember taking my son when we were going fishing once into a croft house in Lewis, and to old Katie McLennan in Seaforth's Head. And, she opens the door and she ushers him in, and then she kind of half closes the door. And And she says to me, "Does he know Christ?" There's no bullshitting, you know, they get straight to the point, some of those old Callias. Where was I? COP26. COP26. What was important about the COP is that it was preceded by 3 special reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The special report on keeping global warming to within 1.5 degrees or at the most 2 degrees, and what is needed, if that is to be achieved, for a relatively safe world. The special report on the oceans and the cryosphere, the ice, and the special report on climate change in the land. There's since been a more recent one, report on the physical science of the COP working groups, but these 3 major special reports preceded it. So basically, all of the science, all that we were going to know about the state of the Earth and the opportunities for human response were already laid out in the 3 years that preceded the COP. Those are one of the things that I've summarized in lay terms in Riders on the Storm. So COP26 was not somewhere to expect the science to be revealed. It was already revealed. What was significant about it is that most leaders of the world clearly acknowledged it. One of the achievements of the COP, for example, was this. For the first time ever in a COP, that is to say, conference of the parties being the governments of the world, so the conference of governments or heads of government of the world. The first time ever that they actually said that fossil fuels, they used the term fossil fuels as a source of the problem. Now, friends, if it is cause for celebration that the leaders of the world can finally, in 2021, name fossil fuels as the cause of global warming, you kind of get a sense of how far we have to go. And so the natural reaction is to point the finger at them and say, this is a failure of your leadership. This is a failure that is driven by the corporations, by the billionaire press. This is a consequence that you're all corrupted by capitalism. And you need to get out of the way. Or as Roger Hallam, the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion and its chief strategist, before he got marginalized from it because of his carry-on, as he put it, we have to bring down the governments, and as he would have it, replace them with a citizens' assembly. In other words, he replaced democracy with oligarchy. Oligarchy, government by the few, albeit an oligarchy selectively chosen at random, but to represent a cross-section of the population. How acceptable that would be to those who disagree with the actions it might recommend would be another matter. In my view, that is why we need representative democracy and not just participative democracy. The one actually needs to represent the other. But the point about such an approach is that it points a finger at the governments, it points a finger at the corporations, but it carefully avoids the finger pointing back at ourselves. And in the Green movement and on the left, and I say somebody who is coming from those positions, there is a huge reticence towards saying it's got anything to do with me. It's them that's got to fix it. We demand the government does this. We demand the government does that. And who is this we? The Green parties in this country typically, they're lucky to pick up 5% of the vote. So let us be careful in what we demand, unless we are to succumb to the hubris of giving more weight to our own views than is actually supported by what comes through in the ballot box. Because if we are not going to do it by the ballot box, if we are going to do it by more autocratic or authoritarian measures, then we need to consider, what if other people who might also want to do things by autocratic or authoritarian measures decided to give themselves the same mandate? And who then is going to be better at fighting? Because that is what it will come down to. Who will be better at the violence necessary if we are going to bypass democracy, where whether we agree with the outcome or not, whether we are pro-Brexit or anti-Brexit or whatever it might be, nevertheless, it was decided, whatever was decided, by democratic process in which each person had a say. Now, the reason I'm raising this issue is that when I look at the limitations of the COP, those limitations are intrinsic to the framing. I don't know of any informed person who had high hopes of this COP before it took place. Basically, what happened was exactly what we all expected to happen, which was not a great deal. The best you can say is that for a couple of weeks it focused the world's attention, and we're now on to other things for the time being. The best you can say is that it's given a policy nudge. It has nudged policy in certain directions. And where policy shift is not going to be so costly that it costs votes in the ballot box, then the politicians will go for it. So it was easy enough for Nicola Sturgeon, who incidentally I very much support in most of her policies. But it was easy enough for her to come out against the Cambo oil field, while, as I understand it, most aspects of such energy policy are still devolved issues held in the palm of Westminster. So it's easy enough to make that kind of commitment when you're not the one who's going to be having to carry the responsibility for it. And this is what bothers me a lot about our green politics, that it's gesture politics. It's about setting targets that then don't get met. On the optimistic side, it gives a nudge in the right direction. On the optimistic side, Scotland, with abundant wind energy and lower costs of harvesting renewable energy, has decarbonised much of its electricity supplies. But of course, it's relatively easy to pick those low-hanging fruit because there's an economic driver. When wind becomes cheap, yes, harvesting the wind is going to make sense. There's an economic driver. When you're faced with a church like this, what do you do? What do you do with a building like this if, as I've just been told, heat pump heating is not going to be practical? Well, I've suggested one session. You all have, instead of cassocks hanging at the door, or you have cassocks, you have heated cassocks. That's my practical suggestion to you tonight. I'm lovely and toasty warm in here. So this deep sense of deadness coming out of the COP. Yes, some grounds for optimism, some things that we can trumpet. But basically a sense of, even I can't remember what the main points are. Where does that leave us? When we now understand the issue, see, the climate change deniers, those who are saying it's not happening, they're mostly behind us. They're confined to the newspaper cuttings of their right-wing newspaper columns that try to fend off political change by making out that climate change was a hoax. Very few people take them seriously any longer. We are now at a different place than we were back when Agenda 21 and all the rest of it took shape 30 years ago, is that there's now no serious dispute about how serious the situation is in the world. The problem now is rather different. The problem now is that when you look at the figures, we have a world of 8 billion people just about, knitted together by just-in-time supply chains, knitted together by a global economy that you can't just stop without causing massive human suffering and civil unrest, and yet which is driven by the energy intensity of fossil fuels. What I mean by energy intensity is that that candle there, here for liturgical purposes, in terms of the light output, is incredibly inefficient. It's a very inefficient way of burning paraffin wax. That's just the way a candle flame is. It's not a good use of oil to burn it like that, unless for purposes of beauty, like we have here. But packed into that candle, packed into the wax of that candle, is an absolutely colossal amount of transportable energy. And that's why it's oil and gas and coal that basically power the world. And if you're going to stop them, the one good thing you can say about India forcing the last-minute change in the COP resolution, to say, instead of saying phasing out coal, India forced the change of saying phase down coal. The one thing you can say about the Indians is that they were honest. They were honest because they know that as producers of the kind of consumer goods that we consume, they can't do that without coal or with a massive increase in nuclear, which would be the other option. Solar, perhaps, but there's still issues of storage and so on. So basically, at least they were honest in saying that. But where it leaves us was this gutting feeling of what can we do? What can we do without causing civil arrest? Look what happens in France. Look what happened in England with the fuel strikers in reaction to relatively small, very small tax increases on transport fuel. They get out, they block the roads. How can the government respond? The government has to become more authoritarian. What does that do to trust in government? You know, you end up getting Brexit or whatever. You see the course of action by which one necessity leads to another necessity, which leads to disillusionment and so on. Why? Why? Because our framing of reality is too small. Greenhouse gas emissions are global population multiplied by our average level of consumption. You can affect that equation in two ways. You can either see a reduction in population, or you can see a reduction in material consumption. I don't see any way out of that equation. You reduce one or the other. And when I say a reduction in consumption, I mean the greenhouse gas emissions of consumption. Therefore, if you can decarbonize energy, if there is scope to do that, you will decarbonize consumption. Population is something we're not allowed to talk about on the right and left. Now that's odd, because it used to be talked about a lot in the 60s into the early 70s, and then it became taboo. What happened is that the right wing jumped onto that bandwagon. The right appropriated that agenda and say, yeah, too many Indians, too many Chinese, too many Africans, let's have population control. At which the left and the Greens in reaction, not in response, but in reaction, said, well, if they're in favor, we've got to be against. And who would want to support population control? And so it doesn't get talked about. And yet, as I point out in Riders in the Storm, when you look at what is happening to population dynamics in the world just now, in a growing number of countries, population rates, fertility rates, the number of children per woman of childbearing age is dramatically falling. In India, it's down to 3.4, I think it is. In the south of India, 1.8, where you've got a progressive government. The UK, 2.2. Ireland, 2.1, a Catholic country. Portugal, a Catholic country, 1.2. Brazil, 1.7. Malaysia, a Muslim country, round about 2.1, I think it is, 2.2, something like that. What brings that about are two main factors. One is social security, brought about by social justice. When people know that they will be looked after in their old age, and so they don't need to have a lot of children to look after them, there is no longer the driver to have large families. And the other driver is women's emancipation. Most women, when they are free to choose not to be chained, pregnant, barefoot, and in the kitchen. Most women, if they have the vote and can engage in politics, if they have equal access to education, if they have the right to engage in economic activity, basically, if women are free, most women would appear to choose smaller rather than larger family sizes. Therefore, the solution is clear. If you bring about social justice, and if you bring about women's freedom, population will start to look after itself. And the pathways to do that are laid out in the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which I commend to you. So my first point tonight is that we need to reclaim that agenda, not as population control, but as an agenda of liberation and of justice. In my lifetime, world population, I was born in 1955. I turned an old age pensioner last week. In my lifetime, world population has gone up 3 times. But, carbon dioxide emissions from consumption have gone up 6 times. In my lifetime, consumption is twice as much an issue as population. And that's the one we want to look at even less. Because when we look at what drives consumption, specifically what drives consumerism, as consumption that is in excess of what is needed for dignified sufficiency of living, when we look at that, it's because we are suckers for having our psychological and spiritual needs filled by false satisfiers. I can't get no satisfaction because I try and I try and I try, and I'm buying a stairway to heaven, as the great rock lyricists recognized. So ironically, being exemplaries of it themselves. I can't get no satisfaction. And so it's when we come to tackle consumption, indeed, when we come to tackle what it needs to be in the human condition, that will allow us to follow through those 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals of combating poverty, ill health, inequality, the lack of peace and justice, all of these things that are listed there. It's when we come to tackle that we see we need to pay attention to those fingers pointing back to us, each and every one of us. because we're all complicit. I'm as complicit as the next person in a world dependent on high levels of fossil fuel use. We're all complicit, and only if we start to cut out our unnecessary consumerism and find our satisfaction in things that give life will we have a hope of turning down the heat and hopefully turning it down to a level where a lower level of world population multiplied by a lower level of material consumption will result in fewer and fewer emissions, combined with technologies that progressively decarbonize the remaining energy sources we are still using from fossil fuels. Friends, that to me is why climate change is a spiritual issue. It's not enough to tackle it only at a psychological level, although that is hugely important. It's certainly not enough to handle it only at the level that the COP could deal with, namely the politics, the economics, and the technology, because those things will not be enough if we in ourselves are not enough to use them wisely. And so I put it to you that far from the days of faith organizations and the work of deepening our spirituality being over, we now have a prompt to recognize that that work must begin in earnest. And as you know, spiritual work is the work of the widow's mite. Spiritual work is the work of the mustard seed. Spiritual work is not about the big gestures and achievements. Spiritual work is what builds up from a parish level, from the parochial, para-oikos, para as in parallel lines, oikos as in the word ecology, economics, and ecumenical, meaning the neighborhood. Parochial alongside the neighborhood. This is why to be a parish, however you would define that, and I know the Church of England is having great difficulties with that just now, but however you might define to be a parish, to be a neighborhood of people of faith, being salt to the earth, letting in the light of the world, is the only real place where I see hope. And that work will be a joy whether it outwardly succeeds or not, because none of us have got a God's eye view. That's why this work is a work of faith. Oswald Chambers, a Victorian Edinburgh clergyman, preached on the discipline of disillusionment. He said we must allow ourselves to be disillusioned, to be stripped of our illusions. If we are under the illusion that we can deal with climate change in terms of politics, technology, and economics, we're going to be constantly in despair. But it's not going to be enough. It's important. It is important, but it is not enough. We must disillusion ourselves from expecting something like the COP to be able to do what we might have been hoping it to do. And then the discipline to be a disciple, that which you follow, the path that we follow, is one that connects with real reality, that goes outside and looks up at the stars and says, there is something, rejoice, rejoice, rejoice. Friends, I started with a prayer. Where did I put my glasses? I was zipping up my, all my technology, my Bluetooth microphones and all the rest of it. You know, thank goodness for the technology, I say. Let's not play that one down. I'm no Luddite, as you can see. Blessed be for the technology. But not just the technology alone. Agriculture, technoculture, or human culture, said Panikkāji in 1991. And he left us with a set of 9 sutras. He left us in Glasgow in 1991 with 9 sutras, a Hindu-Buddhist term which means a thread, basically a thread of prayer, a thread of spiritual reflections. They're beatitudes in Christian tradition, as sutras in that Indic tradition. And so I'd like to close again with prayer again in honour of the wisdom Panika brought to Scotland, both in his Gifford lectures and what he took to Glasgow. And these were the words he left us with for reflection in workshops, which then came into the closing plenary of that No Life Without Roots conference. And Alastair, when I've finished, you can pass back, not just yet, but what I've just read is, you can pass back the sheets. I've printed out about 40 or 50. We've maybe got about 60 people in here, but some of you will be together. So if you're together with somebody, just share one. There should be enough to go around. If not, it's on the homepage of my website, and you can download it there. Not only the sense of our precariousness, also the precariousness of the situation where we live. For this moment, which is our moment, or of this moment, which is our moment in time and history. The 9 sutras. One should begin with oneself. And by oneself, not waiting for the push from one side. Opening myself to the entire reality. Where myself is Glasgow, Edinburgh, not outside. Without forcing the consequences. In solidarity, solitude is not isolation. Self-motivated. If it is not self-motivated, no motivation would ever work. Non-violently and beginning all over again. Amen.
Thank you, Alastair, for that deeply engaging and challenging and inspiring talk for us this evening, and the way in which you sort of weaved your insights in such crucial areas as population, carbonisation, and lowering our imprints and our footprints upon the world, but doing so in a way that challenges us as well as encourages not simply to point the finger of blame, not simply to shout louder, but to see where our implicit responsibility lies too. So thank you for everything you brought, and I'm sure as you were listening to Alastair, thoughts were occurring in your mind too, and now's the chance to have a Q&A. So what we shall maybe do in these COVID times is I'll keep hold of the microphone rather than pass it around, but I can hear a question and relay it via the microphone to Alastair, and we can engage with each other that way. But I'll put my mask back on to do that too. Okay, who would like to start us off with a question for Alastair? Alastair for Alastair. The question, Alastair, is that with a hesitation to bring things back to politics, if we want to be active rather than passive or resigned to the situation, why don't we engage with the parties that have got a decidedly green agenda? Why shouldn't we?
Well, we do. And I hope I didn't give any impression that we shouldn't. I was suggesting that the parties that have a green agenda need to widen it quite radically. In my view, they allow it too much to be framed in terms of the technical aspects of what needs to be done, and not enough in terms of the social, psychological, and I would say spiritual aspects of what need to be done. And since the question is about politics, I would add another thing, which is about the corruption or the perversion of politics. I put in a call tonight, and I know that it's unpopular in some circles, for the power of representative democracy when we make use of it. But of course, a lot of people just don't bother to vote, or if they do vote, they don't inform themselves very much about what they're voting for. And when you ask people why they don't vote, they say, well, it's all corrupt. It's all been corrupted by the billionaire press. It's all been corrupted by the powerful political donations. Well, here is my practical suggestion. And I don't know whether there's any reason why this couldn't be applied in Scotland. I just don't know enough about devolved powers on this matter. But I would suggest that any politician should be asked this question. Given that it should be one person, one vote, and not one corporation buying many votes, will you commit to completely outlawing corporate donations to political causes? And furthermore, will you commit to limiting personal political donations to a percentage of average national pay, so that no corporation can use its voice politically in terms of influencing elections, and so that no wealthy individual can disproportionately use their money in influencing elections? Now, why that has never been adopted when, for example, there have been Labour governments in this country, I do not understand. I mean, they rely on money from the unions, but look how much more the other side of things gets from the corporations. So I would ask those kind of questions. Clean up the politics.
Thank you. Further questions for Alastair? Yes. Hi, Elizabeth.
I believe that there's been an agreement or a protocol here that because of the COVID, the questions are going to be asked by the mic by Sandy. So that's why people are telling Sandy their questions. I believe that's what you're
Yes.
doing. Yeah.
Yes, Alastair, the question is in relation to faith groups and their connection with the whole climate agenda, but specifically in relation to COP26, they're very much on the edge and on the outside. And is that the place they should be, or should they be more central to the argument in the decision-making process?
Did you say in relation to statehood?
No, sorry, faith groups.
Oh, faith groups, sorry.
Faith groups. Yes, faith groups on the outside of the...
I misheard it as state, in terms of Scotland. I think Scotland's actually played a very powerful hand in the COP26, precisely because it was on the outside. My understanding is that Scotland was able to have considerable influence in the networking that it was freed up to be able to do. In terms of faith groups, I think invariably, I mean, this goes back to the whole debate about the relationship between church and state. But invariably, irrespective of the fact that if I take a pound of any coin from my pocket and look at it, I will see a double theological statement. Are you aware of that? You know, those letters, DG, FD, by divine grace, by the faith of God, is a double theological statement on every coin you carry in your pocket. No wonder they're trying to digitize the currency. But basically, that is bygone power. That power no longer holds sway. So faith groups, whether they want to be or not, are certainly in Scotland on the edge of politics, but that carries huge moral authority. That carries huge moral authority. And I know that that matters for quite a number of our politicians. So I would say work with that. Work with the way, the truth, and the life, with the Dharma or righteousness as it gets translated. Work with these things. And what more can you do, you know? Don't despair and give up because you can't do enough. That's the path of hubris. So often, it's small things that happen unexpectedly that can make a big influence. And even if they don't, integrity. Remember the power of integrity. When faced with corruption, answer with integrity. And what is that integrity? But it's a widow's mite. It's the way of the God who says to Jeremiah, yes, the Babylonian is breaking down the gates of the city because you have neglected the widow and the orphan and the poor and the alien in your midst. In other words, it's not so much that God is destroying the city. The city is being destroyed because it has corrupted itself from within. And the antidote to that is a simple faithful. The antidote to that is a simple faithful looking the politician in the eyes at a surgery and asking for honesty and how that works in the soul. And that's why Panikaji says, let me begin with prayer. You see, this is not petitionary prayer. This is not the repetitious kind of droning on kind of prayer. This is a prayer of presence of being. This is a prayer of grounding ourselves in the divine nature, of resting ourselves into the Buddha nature, into Allah, Atman, Brahman, Goddess. As I say, I don't care what word you use for it. The way, the truth, and the life. And then walking your life from that grounding. And neither the prayer of purity and perfection. This is not the kind of prayer that says, I've got to make myself perfect before I can even think about these matters. This is a confessional prayer, a prayer of humility. Forgive us our debts or trespasses or sins or misdemeanors or whatever you want. Forgive us our not walking in the way, the truth, and the life, as we forgive those who do not walk in the way, the truth, and the life.
Further questions for Alastair? Yes.
Thanks for these questions. A speaker always appreciates questions. It opens up a sense of a living community. And, you know, critical questions, even hostile questions, all of these are opportunities to deepen that understanding.
Question for you, Alastair. It's, the questioner was struck by your comment of becoming disillusioned, disillusionment being an important factor. And the question was, how can our faith help us become more disillusioned?
Well, using the term disillusioned in the way that Oswald Chambers used it, which is the literal sense of stripping away your illusions, the task of faith is to open up reality. I am the way, the truth, and the life. The truth shall set you free, said Jesus Christ. What is the word being translated truth from the Greek of the New Testament? The word is aletheia, A-L-E-T-H-I-A, or variations thereon. And this word aletheia means both truth and reality. I am the way, the truth, and the reality. The reality will set you free, because reality is truth revealed. Truth is reality revealed. And an amazing thing, and you'll find I quote the passage in Riders in the Storm, is that Mahatma Gandhi makes exactly the same point from a Sanskrit Hindu perspective, where he talks about non-violence as satyagraha. Satyagraha. Now, graha means force or power. Satya gets translated with many words. Truth, truth force. Soul, soul force. God, God force. Reality, reality force. Because Satya actually means exactly the same as the New Testament's aletheia or aletheian. It means truth as reality revealed. And so what you're seeing there in an interfaith context is an underlying truth of reality being shared with us. And I would say the task of faith groups is to call out truth, as my late friend Walter Wink, an American theologian, puts it. And I would recommend particularly the third of his trilogy called Engaging the Powers. He says we must do three things. We must we must name the powers that be. We must name what power does. We must name political corruption. We must name insincerity. We must name the impossible pathways we are currently on. Have courage, because it does take courage. I always feel uncomfortable when talking about some of the things I've talked about tonight, because I know it's going to rub some folk up the wrong way, and I do not like that. I'm best known for my work on land reform. And you'd think I really enjoy hammering the lairds, but actually I don't. I feel uncomfortable with it. Naming the powers that be is an uncomfortable process. It requires a certain courage, which means strength of heart. Then you can unmask the powers that be. Unmasking the powers is revealing how they cause their oppression. That's why I use a lot of poetry in my writing, because poetry is the expression of ways of deep seeing that prose alone often can't reach. So you reveal what is oppressive about it. Corporate donations to politics. What is oppressive about that? To people who favor that kind of thing, to shareholders who might vote for it, it's common sense. We're representing our interests. They don't think it's true that they are actually perverting the course of democracy. They don't think that's true. So unmasking the power is explaining these things, encouraging each other to think it through. Have you got a pension? Have you got money in the bank? Okay, let's unmask the powers and acknowledge we're all parts of the capitalist system. It may not be our choice, but we're all parts of it. Do you shop around, like I do, for the best deal on the internet? Well, let us name the reality that that process may be driving down wages. Or do you, as my wife did last week when ordering some boots, order it direct from the supplier, which is one that has a high ethos, because these kind of fair trade, right relationship companies give you the opportunity to buy in a different way. So naming the powers, unmasking the powers, and thirdly, engaging the powers. And Walter Wink sees the process of engaging the powers that be as a process of non-violently calling them back to a higher God-given vocation, higher God-given calling. In Christian theology, all power is God-given. That's what Romans 13's maintaining. But in human hands, power is inevitably corrupted. In January, I'm going to be talking to the Jewish Cultural Centre and the Edinburgh Interfaith Association. You'll find details on my website if it interests you. But one of the things I will be saying to our Jewish friends is that their tradition recognizes that power in human hands gets corrupted. And that's why they have the principle of the Jubilee, that every 7 years and then every 50 years, big time, real estate like land will be redistributed, it'll be redivided. And the prophet Ezekiel in chapter 47 says that when the land is redivided, the children of the alien who reside amongst you, the children of the foreigners, will be given an equal share of the land and will be treated as Israelites amongst you. Now, how's that for theology of how we treat refugees? How's that for theology of when climate change is coming about, not because of what Africans have done, but what we, the colonizers, have done with our wealth? And then we look at them fleeing wars in which we have been complicit, coming across the channel. What kind of a spiritual depth does it take to name the powers, unmask the powers, and engage the powers, and the humanity necessary to stop desperate people drowning in the way that we are seeing? You see the power that theology, or the knowledge of spiritual traditions, combined with spirituality as a power of the heart and the grounding in God consciousness. God come to my heart, God come to my heart. Om mani padme hum, God come to my heart. You see the power that starts to bring in. And you see the difference in tone it brings when you talk about these things. If you talk about these things in terms of normal dialogue, you talk about it at a political level, and it becomes argy-bargy between the different political parties. I'm talking about it at a meta level, where you get behind or beyond that, at a level where you can reach through to one another's humanity. That's the work of faith, and of faith groups in these times.
Thank you. One final question for Alastair. Yes. How do we engage our young people in these ideas?
On Thursday, I did something which I've got pictures of on my phone here, but we decided not to share out on the internet because some people would be distressed by them. And basically what happened is, it was COP26 coming up, being based in Glasgow, I'm one of the founding trustees of the Gal Gael Trust, which, if I might simplify, rebuilds community or holds a space hospitable to the soul, to quote the American Quaker Parker Palmer. A church should be a space hospitable to the soul. A community group should be a space hospitable to the soul, in which outwardly we do things like building wooden boats, but inwardly it's about holding context of community that reconnects people with nature and with human nature and brings back life where life has been driven out by poverty, intergenerational poverty. And before the COP, we were raising money because we knew a lot of people would be coming from Glasgow, and our premises are literally just round the corner. We're at the back of the Ibrox football stadium, just beside, pretty much as close to the COP as you can get before getting into the exclusion zones. So we knew a lot of people would be coming and a lot of young people would be coming. And we knew we had to feed a lot of people. So how do you feed the 5,000? And we were feeding up to 150 at a time in Gal Gael. You put out a call for a little help from your friends. Now, when I was a student in the summers growing up on the Isle of Lewis, I used to get a summer job as a gilly and pony boy on the sporting estates, rowing the salmon boats and taking the ponies out into the hill to bring back the carcass of the deer. And that gave me huge respect for the work of deer stalkers, because the stag has not yet been born who wears a condom. And without contraception, like any animal population, the deer herds go crazy. There are far too many deer in Scotland, as is widely recognized. And when that happens, there are a number of consequences. You get overgrazing, young trees get eaten, you can't establish forests, the deer break into people's gardens. I keep on being sent pictures from Lewis of deer marauding into people's gardens now that it's no longer possible for every self-respecting crofter poacher to have a rifle from the Second World War, or maybe the First World War, under their bed, as I have literally seen to be the case in the past. And on roads, road traffic accidents. I saw a statistic yesterday, 65,000 collisions with, was it 65,000? Something of that order. It was a very high amount of road collisions, and 65 of them, I forget how many thousand, but 65 of them resulted in serious injury to people of deer crossing the roads. Okay? Now, I therefore put out on the Twitter to the Scottish gamekeepers saying, we've got a lot of people coming into Glasgow. And it's a reality in the part of Glasgow where we are that, not everybody's into a West End vegetarian or vegan diet. And poor people do benefit from eating meat and fish, so we have a mixed menu when we put on community meals. And I said, if any of you've got a deer going spare, it's a hind culling season just now, any chance of dropping one into us? Well, the result was that on Thursday, a man called Davy Quarrell dropped a roe deer into the Gal Gael, complete with the skin. So we hoisted it up, and this is where the controversial pictures come in, because you would see me teaching our young people in the Gal Gael how you process meat. Here is wild meat that has been shot locally. It was shot at the back of the Easter House shopping centre under license in order to prevent deer marauding onto the M8 and causing accidents. So these are the kind of things that go on necessarily in the background. And I assure you, if the deer are not culled, they starve in winter or they get diseased, and it's a horrible sight to see, which is why I've got such respect for the many stalkers I've known and worked with. So that's where this one was shot. So just imagine, in Greater Governorate in Glasgow, And, I wish I could just put the pictures out, but even the one I put out, we got some pushback on it. Because people just don't understand these things, and you get a knee-jerk reaction, or what I would consider to be a knee-jerk reaction coming in. But basically, I was teaching our folk how to pull down the skin and then take the knife and pare away the membrane between the skin and the flesh, gradually removing the skin, doing it carefully so we can then tan the skin. It'll immediately be salted and then further processed and made use of. And that night we had a meal, a community meal of 30 or so people, and we fed, we used a third of the deer, a third of that venison, in feeding them. And we had people there was a woman, a Native American woman, Native North American, Canadian, I think, studying food, indigenous foods and so on. She was there, and we were saying, look, here we are, we're doing it right here in Govan. And it's reconnecting people with place. Now that is a very visceral, your question was, how can we reach young people? I would say reconnect them with reality. I take them out, I've got Varen and I, my wife and I, we've got 2 inflatable canoes, and we take them out on the River Clyde. I mean, our Galgale boats do that also, of course. We take people out on the river so they can see the beauty of the river, and they can see the life of the river, which you only see when you're on the water. In the summertime, I take young folk out mackerel fishing to either Closh Point of Gurrock or to Kinghorn, and reconnect them with that's about. And then while you're out there, you start talking about fisheries policy. You start talking about what's happening to the oceans. You start talking about all of these things. So reground people in nature. And it's an amazing thing how when you start doing that, human nature comes up. So a young guy from just 4 houses along in our street in Govan. And I had him out fishing a year ago, just over a year ago. And you know what? He says to me, have you read anything by Alan Watts? Now, Alan Watts was an Anglican minister who basically did much to introduce Hindu and Buddhist thinking to the West. I said to him, how do you know about Alan Watts? He said, I've been watching podcasts and so on about him. So there we are, we're fishing for mackerel, and we're talking about spirituality. And the next thing is, his mother comes along and I'm cutting the hedge. And some of you will have known Father Jerry Hughes, a Jesuit priest from Ayrshire, born in Ayrshire, who did a lot of Ignatian discernment workshops in Scotland before he died. And he wrote, in the 1980s, he wrote a famous award-winning book called God of Surprises. And Jerry's name had come up, and I thought, I need to get a copy of that book just in case. So I ordered one up second-hand on the internet, just a couple of quid. And along comes this lad's mother. And she said, oh, it's great what you've been doing with her son. It's great that you've been having this conversation. She said, I'm Catholic, but I've gone back to the Catholic, but I don't really know much about it. And so I shouted up to Varen and I said, Varen, can you get me that Jerry Hughes book and throw it out? So I give her God of Surprises, and I say to her, take a look at this, and if it doesn't speak to you, just post it back through my letterbox, but if it speaks to you, keep it. And I got a text from her later that night saying, this is wonderful. That's how it works. You see what I've described to you there, that anecdote? I've described to you reconnecting people with nature. I've described to you reconnecting with people with where food, at least fish and meat in that situation comes from. I've described to you reconnecting people with the reality that human beings manage nature. And there's good ways you can do that, and there's bad ways you can do it. And in my view, somebody like Davy Quarrell and what the Scottish gamekeepers are doing, specifically with deer. I'm not giving a carte blanche endorsement of what gamekeepers do, but with deer management, exemplary stuff. And then how that then feeds back into spiritual life, what it means to be a human being, that kind of stuff. Folks, this is how we do it. Making community is not rocket science. Making community is a question of saying, are the people fed? Well then, let's light a fire and put on a meal. And allow God to do the rest.
Alastair, we have to thank you very much for this evening, and maybe on a couple of levels. Firstly, on a very shallow level, I'm told that an honorarium is heading in your direction by electronic means, which sounds to me like a technological equivalent of the checks in the post, but there we are. Thank you indeed on that level. But on a much deeper level, we have to thank you for all that you've brought, the great food for thought you have given to us, not only in your main talk, but also in response to the questions tonight, and the way that you've challenged us to look forward, and look forward in hope, as well as recognising the challenges that face us all. So thank you indeed, Alastair, on behalf of us all, I'm sure, here, and those who are live streaming.